D. James Kennedy Ministries presents Truths That Transform.
In the next few decades, that Islam will have taken over France and Germany and England.
The answer to the problem of radical Islam is the gospel of Jesus Christ, is the God who sent his son to die for us rather than us sending our sons out to die for God.
Sharia is one of the most awful, repressive, totalitarian, political, military, legal doctrines man has ever invented.
This is Truths That Transform.
Thanks for joining us on this edition of Truths That Transform, a viewer-supported program. I'm Frank Wright, president of D. James Kennedy Ministries, and I hope you'll visit our website, which contains a wealth of free audio, video, digital, and some print resources, all from a biblical perspective. It's available at djameskennedy.org. You know, hardly a day goes by when radical Islam is not in the news. It has been a major issue in the presidential primaries, and just recently a jihadist attack in Brussels reminds us of the ongoing danger. Yet it seems political correctness keeps America's government from adequately addressing the problem. Joining us today to discuss this further is our own John Rabe, author of the book None Dare Call It Islam. John, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, great to be with you, Frank.
Well, the question that everybody asks when we look at our own government is, why does our government seem afraid to call Islamic terrorism what it is?
It really is troubling, and as best we can tell, it seems to be a rampant political correctness that has infiltrated our government at the highest level, including the president himself, that wants to say that this terrorism is caused by something other than Islamic beliefs, by something other than Islamic theology. And so whenever we see one of these radical Islamist attacks, immediately our government jumps out to do a couple of things. First, to essentially either implicitly or sometimes explicitly deny the connection between the terrorist attack and radical Islam, and instead to say, well, this is caused by other factors. John Kerry famously claimed that one of the attacks is, that several of these attacks are caused by unemployment and by disaffection and so forth. He says, this is not Islam. That's been the standard line of the Obama administration. These attacks do not represent Islam. Well, they don't represent all of Islam, that's certain, but we call it radical Islam. I think what you could really call it is Orthodox Islam. In reality, there has been a streak, there has been a percentage of Islam that has been warlike from the very beginning, and that's been a constant all the way through. So to say, well, this isn't Islam, well, it may not be every kind of Islam, but it's certainly a kind of Islam. So there's a political correctness that wants to divorce the attacks from Islamic theology itself, and then there's also quickly the jump to forestall some sort of backlash. Oh, we don't want to blame Muslims for Islamic terrorism, as if there are all sorts of attacks happening against Muslims in the United States because of anger over these attacks. It'd be nice to see our government worry a little bit more about the front lash rather than the backlash. The backlash is non-existent, but the Islamic attacks continue on.
On this immigration question, as Christians, we're somewhat torn, right? We're worried about security. We want to keep the threat out, but we've always had compassion for those who come and are in need, and we want to, minister to them in some sense. What should be our stance in this trade-off between compassion and security?
That's a big question, because that's been a dominant issue in this election campaign, and we as Christians have to be very careful about that. I don't think we have the option to just take the position that says sort of, I'm on the lifeboat and now I'm going to knock everybody else off the edges back into the water. That's true as Christians, and it should be true for most of us just as Americans. Most of us are not Native American. Most of us are the offspring of immigrants one way or the other. And so we have to recognize that immigration, legally done and regulated among people who want to come to America and be part of America and adopt our core beliefs and assimilate into our culture, have always been welcome if done through a legal process. We want to keep that door open, and as Christians, we want to be compassionate to the sojourner. We want to be compassionate to the oppressed and the people who are trying to come here for freedom, as many of our ancestors did. Yeah. By the same token, government has essentially one job, and that's given to it in Romans 13. That job is to maintain order, even by the sword if necessary, and to protect the people, protect law and order. If we are not going to police who comes in, if we are not going to take a serious look at ideology and religious beliefs when someone comes, and by the way, the government actually requires that religious beliefs be one of the tests for people to come in. For instance, when they're looking for asylum, we're actually required to ask, because you have to be able to demonstrate that you are under religious persecution. We need to be able to balance our compassion with the need for government to do the one thing that it is tasked with doing, which is protecting order and protecting the people. And so there needs to be immigration reform that allows people to come through the open front door, those who want to assimilate, but also does screen out those who would come with an ideology that would seek to change America to a different system, that would seek to upend America, that would seek to destroy America.
John, what's one thing about Islam that if people understood it better might help them to grasp the nature of the threat we face?
I think all forms of Islam, whether it's the radical, violent form of Islam, the orthodox form as I've called it, or whether it's more moderate Islam, all forms of Islam are ultimately about trying to find acceptance with God. And I think we as Christians need to understand that, because what's happened is that a good and right desire to find acceptance with God has led to some terrible things. If you believe that acceptance with God requires martyrdom, if you believe acceptance with God requires slaughtering and killing unbelievers, if you believe acceptance with God requires setting up a caliphate by force, then you're going to end up with some pretty ugly things. And that's what we see happening in the world around us. They want acceptance with God. And we as Christians say, amen. We want acceptance with God too. And so if we understand that that's what's driving this, the desire for acceptance with God is what's driving it, then we will realize that we as Christians also have the answer to the problem. And that's ultimately the only thing that can solve this. The answer to the problem of radical Islam is the gospel of Jesus Christ, is the God who sent his son to die for us rather than us sending our sons out to die for God.
John, thanks for being with us. It's been great having you here.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks so much. Because the news media and our own government have adopted such politically correct talking points with regard to Islam, there's much you might not know. But in these days of ISIS and terror threats, every American needs to know the truth. Dr. D. James Kennedy shares that truth with us in this portion of his message, Days of Patriotism.
We're facing a foe the like of which we've never faced before. We're facing Islam. Now, this is not something that Christians are very familiar with. If you ask the average American to explain to them what Islam is, most probably couldn't do it. I wonder how many know that Islam teaches that men are superior to women. Women have half the rights of men in a court as a witness. A man may punish his wife by beating her. A man may marry up to 4 wives at the same time. A wife is a sex object for her husband. Muslims must fight until their opponents submit to Islam. A Muslim must not take a Jew or a Christian for a friend. I wonder how many of you knew that. A Muslim apostate, one who turns from Islam, must be killed. Stealing is punished by the amputation of the hands. Adultery is punished by public flogging. Resisting Islam is punished by death, crucifixion, or the cutting off of the hands and feet. Fate decides everyone's eternal destination. These are some of the many rules and laws of Islam that are unknown to most of us in America. This is hardly what you might call the religion of peace. Most people really, until recently, had very little knowledge about the Islamic faith and certainly did not consider it as any real threat. But I might remind you that Islam, Muslims, have on a number of occasions attempted to destroy Christianity. I suppose if I asked someone to tell me what those were, there'd be very few that would stand to the occasion. But I might say to you, if you go way back, hundreds of years ago, their first attempt to take over Christendom and Christian Europe went through what we now consider the eastern side of Europe, and their armies went all the way up to the borders of Germany, where finally they were stopped. But they didn't give up. They then went to the other side of Europe, to the western side, and made a second attempt to take Christian Europe. And there they made it all the way across northern Africa. They crossed into Europe. They made it all the way to the center of France, and it was only there at Tours when they were stopped by Charles Martel, known as the Hammer. He stopped their advance. Otherwise, they could very well have taken not only Spain, but France and possibly Germany and England. But they weren't through yet. They also made an attempt directly to take America, probably before Christopher Columbus ever heard of it. They sailed out into the Atlantic Ocean. They went several hundreds of miles out into the Atlantic Ocean, and finally they were stopped by whom? By the hand of God Almighty. And there was a great storm that swept in on the Atlantic and sunk all of their ships. It appeared that God did not want them to take over Europe or Christian America. But now we have come to a place again where they're giving their lives to take America, Europe. There are those who believe that in the next few decades that Islam will have taken over France and Germany and England. Yes, my friends, this is a very serious encounter that we're having now with the Islamic faith. And you've seen something, as I've just told you, about the commitment that they have to do precisely that. And yet we have many in America whose answer to this problem is very simple. It is cut and run. That wouldn't do it then, and it won't do it now, my friends. We need patriots like Charles Martel, the Hammer, and all of the other Christians that fought so diligently to protect Christianity from the ungodly. We need patriots. We need patriots that are willing to stand up and be firm with those that would do their very best to destroy this country. And I believe that such do exist. And I believe that America is not going to cut and run. I believe that we are going to take our stand in our time and that we are going to defeat the plans of the ungodly.
The hard truths Dr. Kennedy shared with us are not often heard in the mainstream media. The media, and often our own government, tells us one thing, but history and the facts tell us another. Frank Gaffney served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy under President Ronald Reagan. He is now the president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. And as you're about to see, he says the ambitions of Islam are something we should all be concerned about.
I think it's fair to say that the average American is concerned about what they are seeing now on the part of Muslims, not all of them, but many of them, who are making no secret of their determination to impose what they call Sharia on the rest of us.
What is Sharia law?
Sharia is not just law, as it happens. Sharia is a political, military, legal doctrine. It has as its purpose governing all aspects of the faithful Muslim's life and, with their help, the whole rest of the world. It is designed to repress, to ensure submission to the dictates of the Muslim adherents to that program, the faithful.
How about a comment about President Obama and his recent remarks in a mosque?
To everyone here at the Islamic Society of Baltimore, thank you for welcoming me here today.
The first thing to say about President Obama's visit to the Islamic Society of Baltimore is that he was visiting the Islamic Society of Baltimore. President Obama had reason to know, should know, has no excuse for not knowing, that he was visiting a Muslim Brotherhood mosque in Baltimore.
What exactly is the Muslim Brotherhood, and what are their goals?
The Muslim Brotherhood is an international Islamic organization that was founded in Egypt in 1928 and is dedicated to restoring the caliphate. The caliph was the successor of Muhammad as the political, military, and spiritual leader of the Muslims.
The Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated to not only restoring the caliphate, but also to imposing Sharia law worldwide. They want to see strict Islamic law all over the world, even in Western democracies.
There's an internal memorandum which was seized by the FBI from a Muslim Brotherhood operative in the United States, describing how those in the United States saw their work in America and the West. And what they regarded themselves as up to was what they called a grand jihad aimed at the elimination and destruction of Western civilization from within by sabotage. And that is what the mission of the Muslim Brotherhood and its tentacles in the United States is.
Perhaps the Muslim Brotherhood is best understood by their creed. Quote, Allah is our objective, the Quran is our law, the Prophet is our leader, jihad is our way, and death for the sake of Allah is the highest of our aspirations.
The Muslim Brotherhood, which is here in very considerable numbers, has built an enormous infrastructure of mosques and Islamic societies and front groups of various kinds.
Frank Gaffney's group, the Center for Security Policy, notes in their groundbreaking book, Sharia, The Threat to America, that the Muslim Brotherhood is, quote, the root of the majority of Islamic terrorist groups in the world today.
President Obama has been pursuing a program of demographic, if you will, fundamental transformation of the United States.
One of the issues that's come up in the presidential campaign has been the idea of, well, let's stop, at least for a moment, put a moratorium on the idea of more Muslims coming into this country until we have an opportunity to vet them. What are your thoughts on that?
We almost certainly have more than enough jihadists in this country now. I don't think we need to be importing anymore. And the trouble is, of course, especially as the FBI director, Jim Comey, has pointed out, he can't tell. He can't vet, for example, Syrians who are trying to come here as refugees to determine whether they are in fact jihadis. When you can't tell, it only makes sense, if you believe as I do, that you really don't want to bring more threatening, dangerous individuals seeking to destroy this country. And by the way, that is the explicit goal, mission of the Muslim Brotherhood. Then a moratorium on further immigration until you can sort out which Muslims are which, I think only makes sense.
Is that constitutional?
I believe it is eminently constitutional. In fact, it is required under U.S. statute not to enable sedition. Sharia is one of the most awful, repressive, totalitarian, political, military, legal doctrines man has ever invented. And as a result, those who are its enemies, which would include the infidels, women, homosexuals, Jews, Christians, other religious minorities, and so on, have every reason to be concerned about it and, in fact, to want to oppose its predations.
The threat of radical Islam is a clear and present danger. Our president has declared that ISIS is not a so-called existential threat to us. And yet, they're attacking us more and more frequently with deadly results. Now, as Christians, we understand the need to be compassionate toward the sojourner and toward the stranger, and yet we recognize the God-given duty that government has to protect its people. Now, that's a hard thing to do when you ignore the threat, which is what's happening right now. We do have an important resource on this issue that you'll want to get your hands on as soon as possible. And joining us with more is my very good friend, Jennifer Kennedy Cassidy. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you, Frank. You only have to turn on the news to see how essential the issue of secure borders is. The current presidential election is virtually hinging on it. And there's widespread frustration in America because the current presidential administration underestimates the threat posed by radical Islam and refuses to adequately secure America's borders. This could prove to be a devastating mistake. That's why it's absolutely vital that you understand what's at stake here. Americans will go to the polls in November. And as a voter, you need to press for a government that does its job protecting the people. The important new book, Modern Day Trojan Horse, The Islamic Doctrine of Immigration, will help you do that. Most of our family genealogies have lines that extend far outside the United States. We know that sensible, legal, secure immigration has been a great benefit to America. But we must also understand the minds of radical Islamic terrorists. To them, immigration to America is not a pathway to the freedom of Western life. It's a way to fulfill the call to establish an Islamic state by violence if necessary. This doctrine is called Al-Hijra, and you need to know about it. We'll send you a copy of this crucial book, Modern Day Trojan Horse, The Islamic Doctrine of Immigration, as our thanks for your generous donation. Simply write to us at Box 6085, Albert Lea, Minnesota 56007, or call toll-free 888-334-9762, or go online to djameskennedy.org. Our country is exposed, and the toxic combination of political correctness and a determined enemy are putting you, your children, and your grandchildren at risk. If we are to remain a free and safe country, we will need to have secure borders and an immigration policy that makes sense. How can the president protect Americans from radical Islam when he won't even use the term? This vital book, Modern Day Trojan Horse, The Islamic Doctrine of Immigration, will tell you what you need to know about how radical Islam uses lax immigration policies to wreak destruction on Western nations. This could be the most important book you read all year, and we'll send it to you as our thanks for your generous donation to the ongoing work of this ministry. Simply write to us at Box 6085, Albert Lee, Minnesota 56007, or call toll-free 888-334-9762, or go online to djameskennedy.org.
You will often hear it said that Islam is a religion of peace. That sounds fine until you look more closely at the Islamic definition of the word peace. In Islam, peace is attained only when every knee is bent in submission to Allah. That is a definition you will not find in any authentic dictionary. The word peace, under Islam rather, is an equivocation designed to mislead. With ISIS spreading terror attacks in the name of Allah all around the world, it seems increasingly difficult to maintain the deceptive claim that Islam is a religion of peace, at least under any proper definition. There has been a concerted effort on the part of jihadists to influence America, as well as other nations, through terror. Waleed Faris, a prominent American scholar on Islam, says the jihadi strategy is ultimately to be able to influence, if not control, U.S. foreign policy. And there is a longer-term jihad against Christianity as well. The scary truth is, adherents of Islam have attempted to destroy Christianity on a number of occasions throughout history. Think back to the Crusades. The Crusades, far from being colonial aggression, were actually the noble effort to protect Europe from total conquest by Islamists. Ultimately, the Crusades helped save Christendom from being destroyed. Today, the threat from Islam is still ever present. That is why we need people with the moral and political courage to call out the evils of radical Islam and the terror it is spreading around the world. My friends, today we need patriots who will rise to defend America, Western civilization, and the Christianity that gave birth to all of it, standing against those who most want to see them destroyed. I'm Frank Wright. Thanks for being with us on this edition of Truths That Transform. We'll see you next time.
Next week on Truths That Transform.
Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life.
People need to understand and learn how to pray effectively for these Christians who are facing Islamic extremists.
That's next week. Today's program is available on DVD for your gift to this ministry of any amount. Please call, write, or log on to our website today. This has been a production of D. James Kennedy Ministries.